Um, so a little bit about myself. I was born in Portugal, and so I have a slightly different way of thinking because I was born in this little tiny island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean called Pico, Azores. Um, Ana, are you Portuguese by any chance? Um, and so, and I left there when I was young. I was 8 years old, so I've lived in the United States or Canada most of my life. But as an immigrant, as having been brought up in poverty and all of that kind of stuff, you kind of see the world a little differently, and you kind of see things from a place. Olá from Lisboa. You see things a little different, and I never realized that that was the case, but that was the case as I look back in my life. So for me, I always saw work as just something you did because you wanted to do it. It was just in my nature. I started my first company at 16, doing drawings for architects and engineers. I started my second one at 21, selling computer-aided drafting systems to architects and engineers in Canada. And started my third one at 27, doing an internet company for the automotive industry in Canada, the first of its kind, which was at that time we called them portals. So it was sort of everything automotive under one roof, the first to be able to have new cars, used cars, dealers, manufacturers, all of that kind of stuff. And that was back in 95. So that was kind of everything I knew until my 30s. And then my partner and I sold the business to a conglomerate, a media conglomerate. And that really started to change the way I saw the world. Not that I recognized it at the time. I was just stuck in the flow of things. And a few years later, about 10 years later, I found myself being the go-to guy for laying off people. Now, this was the dot-com era, so we had gone up and down about 6 times. And I was the guy that was being shipped around the country in Canada to lay people off by the dozens. And when I kind of rebelled against the CEO about that, the answer was, well, you're the best at it. And that just basically stabbed me through the heart. It was something that I hadn't thought, this is what I want to do. This is what I should be good at. I felt that I was compassionate towards the folks that I was doing it to, I should say. But never thought of it as something I was doing well, because I couldn't sleep for weeks before it happened. I couldn't cope with it. And on a flight back from Edmonton, one day after laying off people that I had met for the first time in my life, I decided that I can't do this anymore. And so that started the unraveling of who I was at that point. And that a number of personal issues arose, family and stuff like that, and found myself back in the Azores for the first time, living there, taking care of my mom after a stroke. So that basically led me to think, I can't do this anymore. I can't even, the startups that I had, after I quit, the startups that I've tried to do just were miserable failures, not because of what they were, but because of where I was at. And so I needed to do something different. So I decided to stop trying to start stuff again. It never occurred to me that I could get a job. That's just not what I do. So I started doing research, and in that process of doing research about myself, how had I become that person? How had I gone from being someone who thought those corporate people are just crazy and evil and all of that stuff, to becoming one of them and doing much of the same thing as they had done that I observed from the outside. So that was the starting point for me on this journey. And over the last 8 years or so, I've been continuously doing research on trying to understand what drives humanity to do the things we do to each other. And that, and the connection with the future work about 4 or 5 years ago through a number of colleagues here in the States led me to realize that something's shifting. It's not just me personally, but there's actually a shift that's happening. And it's not just happening in one country this time, but it's happening globally. And so I think the feelings that I felt during the other sort of fundamental changes that I've experienced in my lifetime, the progression from manual drafting to digital drafting, the progression from analog media to digital media, both of which I was highly involved in. I'm feeling that we're in the midst of another type of shift like that. So that's about me. And I thought I'd kind of tell you a little bit about why I think the way I do. And there's two questions that I pose myself. One is this future of work thing, which I think and hope most of you are kind of familiar with what that kind of encompasses. What's the root problem for it? Like what's the fundamental thing that's creating this? And it isn't, I don't think, something that we mostly talk about. I think it's something that we don't talk about enough. And so I'd like to explore that. And the other question is this an incremental shift that we're doing? Are we just slowly changing how we do work? Or is this a complete paradigm shift that we're at the beginning of? And those two questions are what I've been gnawing at with Andy and a lot of other people and trying to figure out what that looks like. And I'll throw this out and then I'll shut up because it's not about me talking, but there's a compelling story that I learned when I was with AutoNet, the company that I co-founded on the internet. What I learned, because I knew nothing about the automotive industry, of course, I had to research the automotive industry and I had to understand what the heck I was dealing with when we decided to go down that path. And one of the things I realized was that 100 years ago, we went from having, in the United States, 400 cars that had been built, hand-built by up to 1,900 new car company startups is what we would call them today. But these were people, tinkerers, in their garages, in their bicycle shops, in their ironworks, and their horse and carriage livery services and all that stuff, creating cars. 1,900 of them in the United States. And we went from, at about this time, or actually about 110, 15 years ago, we went from having some 400 of these things that they had built to 20 years later, having hundreds of thousands of cars. And not one person would go out and buy a horse and carriage 20 years later. We went from having a couple of 100 miles of paved roads to having tens of thousands of miles of paved roads, all in a short period of time. It was a paradigm shift in transportation. We went from thinking that transportation was this slow process of using horse and buggy, using horse on trolleys, and that, to 20 years later thinking that there's no way we're doing that. In New York alone, we killed millions of horses, where the horses that were drawing a lot of those trolleys and those carriages were no longer needed. So that's the type of paradigm shift that I look at historically. And then 20 years ago, we saw the same thing with the internet. So we did a paradigm shift 100 years ago in transportation, and we did a paradigm shift in communication. And so I think and this is what I want to throw out today, I don't think that the future of work is an incremental process that we're going through, and in 100 years we may have a different way of working. I think we're in the midst of, and we don't recognize it until it turns into it. But I think we're in the midst of a paradigm shift that is as fundamental, if not more fundamental, than the transportation one that we experienced 100 years ago, and the communication one that we experienced 20 years ago. And so that's what I throw out to you folks, and let's engage on that. And I know Andy kind of understands where I'm coming on some of this, but I think even to Andy, this is a little new way of throwing it out there.
Thanks, Jose. So you introduced, I think, two questions. One is it an incremental change? And the other one was, what's the fundamental problem, if you like, or the thing that we're working at as we try and think about the future of work? Do you want to say anything about your view on what you think the answer to that second question is?
I've talked enough maybe for a bit, so let's maybe explore that. I'm just wondering if it makes sense to explore that as part of the answer to these questions, because I think I could go on for too long.
Cool, no problem. So folks, it's exploring aloud. So the spirit of this is let's hear from you. So I think the provocation here is we're in the middle of a paradigm shift, and I think probably for Jose and I, the working assumption is that's because it's bloody well needed. So let's just throw it out there. Any thoughts that prompts for you, experiences, etc.? Just come off mute and speak out, or stick your hand up and I'll go around the screen, whatever's best. Charlie.
Hi, thank you so much for this amazing event. I love the way that you are hosting this conversation, as well as the information that's being shared. And I love that you're framing it with regards to being a paradigm shift, which I completely agree with. I know it's all debatable, but I feel like that's what's happening. My feeling beyond that, or my thoughts beyond that, which I'll frame as a question, for you and for others, is it feels more like a battle that's about to happen, like a bloody battle that's happening. And I actually use that term on LinkedIn, saying it's going to be a bloodbath next year, because there's a power shift that's taking place along with the paradigm shift, which is what happens. And the ones who are in power don't want to give it up, which is always the case, right? And the ones who stand to regain their power, gain power, which are the workers, meaning gaining their own power back to define their own lives and working situations, they need to understand what to do with that power when they get it, and how to, So my question to you is, with regards to the paradigm shift and looking at how, for example, the big banks, the big investment banks are like pushing back on this, and a lot of the fear that we're looking at in the next year that's going to cause these companies to do things that is just clearly going to not be in the best interest of their bottom line or their workers. How do you think this can ideally play out, or might ideally play out, if you were, say, talking to managers right now? What would you say to them? Because I think there's just a lot of fear about not knowing what to do.
Well, so I wouldn't talk to managers or companies. Personally, I think we have to look back at those historical examples. And in neither case did we go talk to the horse and buggy guys and ask them what a car should be like, or should we be doing this change? And what will happen with all the horses, and what will happen with all the old buggies, and what will happen with the way that we used to do it, and a lot about the livery stables and all of those people. That's not what we do. We create a new paradigm, and it's the new paradigm that replaces the old paradigm. If we talk to and try to engage the existing paradigm, we we lose track of what it is that we're doing. And so if we're creating a new way of transportation or a new way of communication or a new way of working, that's what we focus on. And those things, I think, Charlie, from a bloodbath perspective, it isn't about trying to convert the organizations and forcing them. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about giving people the freedom to do the things they want to do. And if in so having that freedom, they create new ways of working, then those new ways of working, just like the car, will emerge and people will slowly or quickly move away from the traditional. So it's not whether the organizations want to change or not. They will either change or die, right? You either became a car sales and or repair and or whatever 100 years ago, or you disappeared from that space. If you were in the horse business or in the carriage business, if you didn't shift over, you were going to go do something else. And so that's what's going to happen, I think, in the space of work. We think of work not as its own innovation, right? We think of work as just the fabric of our society. But I think work is actually just like anything else. It's a technology that we've invented, and that technology is going to be dynamically and irreparably changed over the next 20 years. I don't know if that answers your question, Charlie. That's my thought.
Yeah.
What do you guys think?
Well, folks, let's throw it open. Anna, I saw that you've put something in the chat box, so if you'd like to build on that, please do.
Yeah, I was just sharing that my last year and a half, I'm trying to see what can be my last years of working. I'm an HR professional. I understand pretty well what Jose was telling. I did exactly the same as you. And in a certain point, I really believe that HR has a role in a company. And I was studying new management styles such as self-management, take out all the managers and start asking everyone to connect and to take the company, all the decisions. I participated in one here in Portugal before the COVID, and even though I think we are not yet there, I think we need to have a path to become in that stage. But what I really learned in this period of time is that everything is around our ego. This is what is damaging all professional situations, and it's really strange because we cannot define really what is ego or where our ego is bringing something to the equation of company decisions. But in the end, after all these things I'm seeing, I think that we need to manage, and the new paradigm is to manage the ego of everyone and start really work on what is important besides ourselves. And even though I'm in the path, but just sharing.
Thank you for that. Personally, I think I would reframe that in a little bit different language, but I agree with you 100%, Anna. And what we call the ego, whatever that is, I think is really a way of behaving that we've learned. And we call that way of behavior that is in basically completely engaged in our way of working. We call it force paradigm. And I think that's the paradigm we're about to leave. It's a paradigm where we've learned to build systems that force people to work, where we've learned as individuals inside organizations to be the ones that force other people to work. And even coworkers force each other to work, right? Oh, you're not doing your job. You're not doing your job. I'm going to tell the boss. You know, we have this mentality of it's all about force, right? And I think part of what we're going to shift away from is this idea that work must be forced. We must compel people to work. We must find systems of making them work. And that's really the system of work we have today. To shifting it over to what you said, what's inside us, right? What needs to be done? We all feel it, right? We know we've got so many fundamental problems to fix in the world. But every morning we wake up and we're like, oh, who wants me to do what? Oh, I have to go to work today. And that's what we do. And well, but we're doing stuff that doesn't need to be done, but that's okay, because that's what I'm being forced to do. Why? Because I need to get paid, because I need to, you know, climb the ladder, because. And so I think we're moving from a paradigm of force, a fundamental paradigm of force, to a new paradigm of needs, of human needs, where we're living from inside out rather than being forced from the outside, compelled to do work. Because we'd all work a lot harder if we were doing stuff we loved. We'd all do a lot better work if we were doing stuff we loved and being left to be doing that stuff we love. But we're not. And so we end up compelling each other. And everything that we do in that space of work today, most of us are only doing what is necessary. And so we're conditioned to follow that path rather than conditioned to follow the thing that needs to be done. Sorry for the long answers. It's early in the morning and I just had some coffee.
It's good, Jose. I want to come to Saskia because she's put a question in, but if you don't mind, Saskia, I might just share a thought that I think builds on something Jose said there, which is, those of you that know me will know that I'm not predisposed to telling stories of hope or upbeat stories. I like to hold people's faces in it, but the thought I wanted to share was that I think what you're describing there, Jose, if we look at it almost in sort of evolutionary terms or something like that, or at least in the long view temporarily, is actually a product of human success. So where I'm going with that is the idea that, you know, when we were all, if you like, scrabbling around in the dark, competing over resources, the force paradigm, I think, is what emerged. And it was like, who do I need to stand on to get myself ahead, almost. And the thing that occurs to me about this is that, again, you know, some of the academic literature, at least around how new value systems emerge, is the idea that they emerge in response to the new needs that we're now able to aspire to, because the existing value system has solved the problem it came into being to solve. And I think that might be where we're at, which is the force paradigm and, you know, institutions and current ways of working and all the rest of it have got us largely as a species to a point where, if you like, that every man and every woman can aspire to more purpose, not just feed themselves. And I think the more that need we have for real purpose, real contribution comes into focus in our lives, the more the old paradigm becomes, I think, not just problematic for us, but abhorrent for us. And I think that's maybe where the paradigm shift comes from, is that, in a sense, the success of top-down functional hierarchies, etc., will also be their undoing. It will be, you know, the many rather than the few at the top starting to realize that they have access to purpose and therefore will demand it. And I think that's where it will come from. So for me, the sort of irony is that's back to the point Charlie shared, the bloodbath. The bloodbath, I mean, I get where that's coming from, and I understand the pain that may be involved in this, but in a sense, it draws out the negative, where I wanted to just draw out that maybe this is a sign of human progress. that we're talking about here. And when I think about it that way, it feels more achievable too.
100%. Andy.
So, sorry, I rambled on a bit. Saskia, will I go to you next? You had a question in there. Go on, Saskia.
Yeah, thank you. I did have a question, and I'm also thinking what you're talking about feels like you've got a really long history of collaboration as well. It's not all about competing for the next meal. I think even from centuries and thousands of years ago, you know, we've shown ability to collaborate. So I suppose I'm not quite as pessimistic about human nature. I guess part of the reason we've survived is because we've been able to collaborate.
Absolutely.
My question is to Jose, but also to the group, is in terms, do you see any role at all for institutions? I suppose so I've got a bias in the sense that I work for, you know, health organisation, and whilst I see the limitations and frustrations of a kind of hierarchical, bureaucratic kind of nature of that, I also sense that there is some role for well-organised services in a way, or, you know, I can't imagine, you know, my son had a liver transplant. I can't imagine him having it just in a, you know, in a society kind of completely without institutions or organisations. I suppose I'm thinking, you know, there was something about that, you know, it helped that there was a really well organised team and organisation doing that. So I just, yeah, I wondered what your thoughts are on that. If there is a role, and if so, what?
So there's a lot of questions in there I'd love to unpack, but so the first thing is about what you said about human nature. I 100% agree that human nature is actually more about collaboration than it is competing with one another, right? But we're set up by the paradigm of force to compete, and it's been used against us. We've used it against ourselves, let's put it that way, in order to create the environment where we're all striving to do something for someone else. In essence, that's what we do. And so I think it's not so much what our nature is, it's actually that our nature has been prevented from acting in most cases. So a lot of what I believe is the struggles of employees and employers around the world is the fact that they know that there are better things that need to be done, but they have to do the things that they're being compelled to do. And that's really where our stress is coming from. That's where disengagement's coming from. And as Andy said, you know, we see the purpose that we're on this place to do, on this earth to do, and yet we can't do it because we're being asked to do something mundane. You go run this report and go build this presentation, go do whatever it is, and it doesn't make sense to us. Our human instrument isn't built for that stuff. So that's the first part that I'd speak to. But the second part about institutions is that we've learned how to create organization in absence of top down. I mean, if you think about the internet is a distributed system. Nobody owns it, nobody manages it, nobody controls it. It is a distributed system that has a series of protocols that allowed everybody to build their own website and everybody to build their own services and everybody to do all the things that we all do. We forget that too is a technology, that work too is a technology. And if we see that we've learned how to use these technologies in ways that are more distributed and less force-based, right? Because a top-down system is a force-based system. Right? Somebody's got to force somebody else to abide by whatever rule they set out. And that's what institutions do for the most part. We've not learned in institutional settings to create the right protocols to allow certain behaviors to emerge as we did with the internet, because this technology got started a couple hundred years ago. And so back then we didn't know that. So we're now, I think the human brain is now figuring out, how come I have the right to do whatever I can on the internet and with my friends, and we can get together and we can organize things like this. And when I go to work, we've got endless meetings and other people are making decisions, and it goes on and on and on, and I'm not able to do the same thing. I think that that's what's driving this paradigm shift. It's that innate sense that the world works one way in my world outside of work, and it works in a completely different way. And I think that's where this drive for this shift is manifesting from. It's just what Andy said in slightly different language.
Is this a very Western-centric paradigm shift then? Because when you talk about, you know, the freedoms that the internet brings, for example, well, not everyone in the world experiences those freedoms. And it makes me think of how, you know, power has been concentrated to a point where actually I wonder whether the forces for, whether that's the status quo in terms of the way we work, but it's certainly the status quo in terms of who retains power and how it's exercised, is a lot more concentrated and organized. And I think it probably was, you know, during the development of the internet, let alone the development of the car. And so I wonder, you know, so that makes me think, well, I think it's inevitable. Change happens. How confident are we that that change is going to be universally positive and universally on a global scale and not just, you know, a Western perspective? And I think I'm quite challenged by the idea that change is driven because of the success of the current system at a point where we have bigger inequalities within, you know, our society, the society that I operate within, than ever before, where life expectancy is reducing. And yeah, I think it would be nice to think that it could be a product of success, but it might have to be, if it's going to come, it might have to be a product of revolution. So I don't think that was necessarily that coherent, but that was what was going through my head.
Yeah, so let me grab the piece about how widespread is this. I think it will be more widespread than any other shift we've ever had. How widespread will it be? I'm not sure what it will be, but we have more people using the same communications technology than we've ever had before, by far. I mean, typically you had, if you had a communications technology at all other than word of mouth, you had a small town newspaper or something like that. And that one was a little different than the other one was a little different than the other. When you get to the other side of the world, it was completely different. So today, I think people a couple of generations away from us, I don't think they think all that differently, never mind the political and socioeconomic systems around them. I don't think they think that differently in their brains about how communication works. So it's not so much about what's happening around us, whether we're in China or we're in Eastern Europe or in the UK. I think it's more about the fact that we now see the freedom of this form of communication. It may have some limitations or whatever else, but we now have the control. Before, if you wanted to get something disseminated in any way, shape, or form, you had to go beg somebody to print it for you. And now anybody can wake up in the morning and go on TikTok and publish something. It doesn't seem like a lot to us, but I think in our brains, that means that we now have the power to do things. And why can't we exercise that power elsewhere? And that's where I think is starting to happen. It's that sense of, I have the ability to live my life and say what I want to say and do what I want to do, except in this space. And this technology is keeping me from doing it. So if we are going to build a new technology of work, then that new technology of work becomes something that emanates from people rather than from institutions, and simply tweaking institutions as they are. I don't know if that helps, James, or it hits on what you were talking about.
Yeah, no, I think it does, and I sound kind of pessimistic, but I suppose institutions are a reflection of the society in which they operate, and I'm not convinced that people are free to communicate in society. And certainly some societies have a lot more freedoms than others, but I think that there are still, you know, some restrictions, and so what we're talking about is and perhaps this is exactly what you're saying, it's a bigger than a work paradigm shift, but then that's a huge shift away from the way, you know, everything, it seems like everything functions, which is really appealing.
Well, yeah, I like to call it the future of everything.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, my tuppence worth on that is that I think it can only be an everything shift. It's almost like an evolution in human consciousness, which I know sounds massively grandiose, but I also sort of think that's what we've seen through history. That you know, when you're in a feudal system, that creates a certain way of thinking about the world and your role in the world and what your potential is and what's a legitimate role to play in each other's lives and all of that. And that in a sense is to do with your work, you know, if you're a peasant, farmer, or whatever it is. But in another sense, it just feels completely detached from that, because the work is going out with, you know, a bit of, you know, a bit of wood and metal and ploughing a field. But I think these things are actually ultimately so interconnected that you can't differentiate them. And so the possibilities in any one sphere are entirely conditioned by the possibilities in every sphere. And that's, for me, that's how I imagine the paradigm shift Jose's describing coming about. It's that all these things sort of co-evolve, and maybe at slightly different rates, but they're either mutually supporting each other or mutually undermining, and they're all kind of jostling to find the next equilibrium.
Yeah, I agree. Great.
I think Jose and Saskia are on the same page here. We just need to change the title sometimes to somewhere to something like the future of everything but work. I think the one place that won't change is work, but everything else is changing around it. And if your work is hospitality, your work is likely to remain hospitality. The future of the postal service, the bins, so much in work is not going to change. And if you look in organizations, I mean, take schools, for example. There are young people like my daughter who thrive with COVID and would absolutely delight in a change in our approach to education. But we've never had greater pressure towards conformity and force than now. There were a lot of young people and families who just responded in their own way to the COVID thing, and the reaction has been to double down on the force and compulsion. The first lockdown, my daughter had a great time. She got set a load of work, she got on with it, and once she was done, her time was her own. And by the second and third lockdowns, we were into micromanaged hours. The reaction to a lot of the COVID thing has been, we need to force people to do X, Y, and Z. There's never been greater distrust of human judgment and autonomy in decision making. But I think you're absolutely spot on, because around the fringes, this revolution is happening in people's ordinary lives. It's just happening outside of the workplace. Now, the really difficult bit here is that there are a very, very small number. There is a small number of people for whom the benefits that have been found outside of work can also be found inside of work. And this is where it's going to get politically contentious, because for the privileged few for whom this opens up new possibilities within work, that's glorious, but they tend to be the privileged elite that are using force to get everybody to operate and comply and meet all the governance standards and everything else that they're somehow liberated from. You know, go back a generation, my father could walk into a bank manager, have a conversation with the bank manager, and the bank manager could make some decisions, and it was all very human. That disappeared a long time ago, and with this newfound freedom, people at that level are not going to see the benefit. It's the people further up the ladder. And I think the really weird one here is we are looking increasingly at funding STEM subjects and things like that. So the division is going to be between the privileged few for whom this does apply to work, and they might be the ones that can afford to do PPE, and all the humanities subjects become generalists and go into the higher levels of management, and the mass of the workforce for whom a lot of this gets talked about but doesn't appear. That really worries me.
So I love what you said, Greg, because I believe that that you're right, that this actually is starting outside. Back to the point I was trying to make earlier, that it's really everything around us that's changing, and work is kind of this place. But it is that work is the institution that most of us touch, more so than the political institutions and the legal institutions and the financial institutions that are overarching work. But the proximity to the work itself is the place where we touch. So I think that's why I believe, and I think Andy believes when we have our conversations, that it is this, our ability to make that change ourselves in that space, rather than trying to make that change politically or socioeconomic systems. So I agree that that is the place. What I think I disagree on is that it's not, when we think about it from the current paradigm, then yeah, it seems impossible. People in power are not going to change. The system of education is not going to change. The institutions aren't going to want to change. Agreed. As long as we keep thinking about the old paradigm. But, 100 years ago, the United States was quite literally owned by the train companies. The train companies owned this country. They saved this country and it was bankrupt. They funded it. They bathed the banks. And 25, 30 years later, they were rescued. And most of them either disappeared or bought up by the government. That fundamental change went from something that you would have thought, oh my God, they're in charge, they will never give up, and the car industry has no ability to become something, to not one of them surviving. So I think that's kind of a parallel that I'm seeing here.
I think the danger we've got to realize and recognize is that you can get complex adaptive systems, but you can also describe the same systems as complex maladaptive systems. And yes, we're likely to see a stabilization of something new and different, but the fact that it's stable just reflects the pressures that are in the system, and they're not necessarily ones we're going to want to embrace. So I love the possibilities that are here. And I suppose education is the one place where I would most love to see it thrive, succeed. There is the possibility for finally freeing ourselves from the one place where our institutions are most controlling, where we've turned a whole system into a sausage factory system. But I don't think I've ever seen greater resistance. So yeah, I worry that we might end up more at the maladaptive end.
It's always darkest before dawn.
I chuck in a quick thought there. Again, I've got massive sympathy with, I think, what you're seeing there, Greg. But in terms of what you're then saying from what you're seeing, I want to say something different, because I think, I mean, I put something in the chat box, an article that talks about how what tends to happen at the transition between one value system and the next, or a paradigm shift, is you get that polarization, and the old paradigm and the new become more vociferous, and it's that battle Charlie talked about. And there is no guarantee that the new paradigm wins out. And I, in my sort of darker moments around this, worry that there's such hegemony in the status quo paradigm that its ability to defend itself is pretty robust. And could that kill off the emerging new paradigm? Could it just, you know, outmuscle it? And I think the answer is maybe. Like, I mean, that's possible for sure. But one of the things I sort of feel is the more we can draw attention to the emerging new value system, maybe the more that we can cultivate it, embolden people. You know, I go on about this idea of sort of moral outrage or whatever, but I think, you know, the question that I guess I would put into the mix on this one is, can we imagine a future generation in which we look back and people go, can you believe that they had bosses? Can you believe that? Can you believe that, like, they got out of bed in the morning and went into the office at the time someone else told them to do things that somebody else told them, and they were treated for the whole of their lives like they were irresponsible, and they just sucked it up? And personally, I can believe that, you know, a future generation would just find that absolutely mind-boggling. And so I wonder if the opportunity is to cultivate in people that sense of, hang on a minute, what's the role that I'm allowing others to play in my life? You know?
I know Charlie has a question, but maybe I could just throw a little bit in there, Andy, because the title of our talk was, it's not only not no bosses, but also no employees. And I think the point you just made is really critical there. Not only do I think people will say, can you imagine that there was a world with bosses back then? But I think people will also say, can you imagine that there were such things as employees? I think the idea that we have in our heads, that we've grown with over the last couple of 100 years, that you are employed as a machine to service some other greater service that other than yourself and your community and the people that you care about and the world around you, that is actually a distraction that we will see in sometime in the future, and realize that distraction is what caused a lot of the problems that we have today. Work, being employed, is not solving our evolutionary problems. Being employed is a distraction from our evolutionary problems, and often creates our evolution, the problems that we're seeing emerge. So I think that's really, it's not just getting rid of bosses within the current paradigm. It's changing the paradigm so much that the idea of being an employee, and therefore, why would you need bosses if there are no employees? I think that's really where we go.
Thanks, Jose. Will I bring Charlie in? Yep, Charlie.
Hi,
Hi.
I love this. I just really, I have to say, there are a lot of these conversations that are happening, right, about the future of work and where we're going. And I think everybody agrees that it's just, it's a bit of a mess right now. But it's interesting because I don't hear the conversations being had the way that I'm hearing it here. And that's not to disparage how others are having the conversation. I think we need to, you know, have them in a number of different ways on different platforms and different, you know, which is all good. I wish we heard more of these types of exploratory conversations and the way that you guys are framing this. So thank you again for this. To your point, Jose, and actually to what I'm hearing altogether, I don't want to say I worry. I don't want to project that onto onto the conversation, but I do worry that, again, when we talk about the power shift, right? That it's not just about the idea that the bosses are going to have to, at some point in their way, however it's going to happen, figure out that if they're not going to let go, they're going to have, it's going to be snatched from them. In other words, the idea that that this is going to be the status quo for the next 50 years is just not realistic. It's just not. Um, but also, more importantly, that the workers know what to do with that newfound power. I think we're beginning to see that because people are saying, I'm going to quit. I don't care. I don't care. I don't have anything to go to, but I'm quitting. We're seeing people quitting, not knowing what they're going to, but not being afraid to let go of their jobs or whatever. But then we have this competing, going back to the battle, and I hope I don't sound negative, but we have this competing narrative. The media is the mainstream media is very powerful. They're powerful in their ability to shape and form narratives and to get us to cling to one even when we don't want to. So Bloomberg today did another, big piece on how we're going back to the way things were. And to your point, Jose, I saw just now on MSNBC a big article on how employees are concerned that they're not going to have career advancement if they stay home. And so I guess my question to you and to everyone is, how do workers, once they begin to understand that this is not what I want, I have to figure out what I want, how do they counter those narratives aside from just turning off the laptop or their phones? Because that's not going to happen realistically, right? And a lot of these narratives are driving policy or vice versa. So how do people counter or make sense of the conflicting narratives in media that is playing a powerful role in this, how this plays out?
I think media is powerful. I don't think it's as powerful as it once was. And it seems to be that as powerful as it is, it in some ways it is actually feeding the rebellious spirit of people. It kind of reinforces the force paradigm in many ways. So, a lot of people now read the article. We have millions of people in the United States that are gig workers, that are self-employed, that are contract workers. This is happening at an unprecedented rate. These are people that are already leaving the work system as we traditionally know it. They're not willing to have the traditional relationship with an organization. And that's just increasing exponentially. I believe that that's the starting point of this paradigm shift. So, and those people aren't listening to what Bloomberg says about corporations or about institutions, or they're creating their new mindset and worldview based on what they're experiencing themselves. And I think that's what they feed with one another. They feed that in their communities. They feed that into the younger generations. I've got two stepdaughters, and they're in 19 and 21, and they're wondering what this world looks like for them. And they're seeing that their colleagues are not going out to work for Apple and IBM and whatever. They're figuring out new ways of doing things and starting up new kinds of organizations. So I don't think that what we're talking about is the establishment in the media or the establishment in institutions. What we're talking about is a new groundswell of change that will push out those things, not compete with them, not try to change them, not try to change the narrative. In fact, their old narrative will only reinforce that the new narrative is more viable than the old narrative. So it's not about shutting them up or about competing with them. It's simply about having a narrative, a different narrative that is more compelling to the folks that are coming along next. And they're the ones that are going to make this change. This isn't about changing a 60-year-old's mind, right? This is about a 25-year-old who says, I will never work for a corporation ever, because they've destroyed the earth, because they've created all of this mess, and how do we fix it? That's what I believe.
Although, I think that's amazing. Can I just add one thing? Because I so agree that the media is not, that's a fact, they're not as powerful as they once were. And they are actually contributing to this exhaustion that I think a lot of us feel about, like, oh, enough. Like, just enough. I think we've been just beaten by the media and their narratives. And to your point, I think it's the 25-year-olds. And you know what? I also think it's the ones who are retiring early who are like, you know what? I'm out. I don't need this anymore. It's just incredible to see how it plays out across the generations, because I'm a Gen Xer and I've not had to, I've been an entrepreneur for the 11 years now. So I haven't worked in an office in a long time, but even amongst my peers and stuff, I've been hearing for a long time, I don't need this crap. Like, I don't know. So it's really fascinating to see how different generations are coming, different people are coming to their own realization. And you're right, they're not colliding or talking over each other. They're just everyone's just kind of saying it's okay to figure out your own path.
Yeah, that's very true. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Charlie. And so I don't want to draw an unnatural end to things, but I also don't want people to feel like they have to sit there politely, given that we're a few minutes over our time today. So accepting that we can hang on if we want to hang on, I just thought I'd say thank you, first of all, to Jose for sort of providing the main stimulus to our conversation today. But thanks to everyone for coming along as well and engaging with that. I think it was, for me, it was particularly interesting to take a conversation Jose and I've been having in private for about a year and put it out there and get some new perspectives. So thank you. I've thrown a few links into the chat box, folks, about future sort of sessions like this, but on other topics. Hope to see you at those. If anyone's interested in joining in with our community of practice, so we have a little community of practice that's based in Facebook, but it meets on Zoom for essentially sessions where people bring their own topics and we just kind of help each other out. Then go to the link that I've just posted just now and you can find a way to sign up via Facebook. As always, really sort of interested to hear any thoughts, feedback, etc. And if any of you are interested in running one of these sessions, we're also really interested in that. So if you need to go, thank you for coming. Feel free to go. If you want to stay, feel free to stay on.
Well, just in case anybody wants to leave, I'll say thank you so much, Andy, for this opportunity and for drawing all of this out of ourselves over the last year, because I think today's conversation would have been completely different a year ago. And so thanks to you for listening and for contributing as much as you did to us getting here.
Oh, that's kind of you. Thanks, Jose. That's cool.
Be interested in an international perspective on this. Thinking about the British system in particular has gone through so many changes that our young people now are almost being infantilized throughout school and education, to the point where an undergraduate degree now is very much spoon-fed, and the level of autonomy on the part of young people is perhaps far less at the age of 23 than would have been the case at the age of 16 a generation ago. So we've got young people in their 20s in the UK who actually just thinking independently is still a bit of a strange notion. Having any freedom to do anything is a bit of a strange notion, but I can't imagine that that's globally. So I suppose one of my thoughts would be, which parts of the world is this paradigm shift going to happen in most actively? And how long is how long's the lag likely to be before we get the structural changes in the places like the UK to allow us to play catch up? Because I can't imagine we're going to be on the top, on the rise of the curve or the top of the curve. And I think it could be a bit like the introduction of business process re-engineering and the Toyota way and all these other paradigm shifts that have happened in the past, that some countries are just hopelessly late in getting on the bandwagon?
I think the answer to that is history. And history shows us that the new paradigm shifts are often done in the places where the old paradigm isn't quite as robust. So we see the mobile phone in many countries completely was leapfrogged landlines, right? But it was harder to displace physical lines, landlines, when you already had a system of landlines and everybody had them and so on and so forth. So I think the fact that we're really good at force in the US and the UK is going to make that transition a little bit harder, but and possibly slower. But I don't think, unlike other transitions, I don't think this is going to be localized as much as it has been in previous transitions. I think this is going to be a global transition. It's going to be a global shift that, though it may get sparked in South America, in Asia, and parts of Europe and Africa, I think it will, over the next 20, 25 years, consume the world. Because I can't see that it stops at boundaries like it has in the past, right? The past, we had boundaries. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have the ability to work anywhere in the world remotely. We didn't have all of the things that we do now. So why would I work for a company that enforces working rules of today in my small town in Southern England when I could work for a company that's out of Colombia that is offering me the ability to work the way I want to work? I'll just do that, and I can do it. So why not? So I think those pressures are going to put a tremendous amount of pressure on the establishment in a much more rapid way than the way we've been thinking about this incremental from the inside of organizations out, where the organization is choosing to make the change rather than the organization is going to be forced to make the change or be displaced.
That's got interesting implications for someone in Saski's position, hasn't it? So you get to the point where it's more attractive for GB qualifying doctors to actually become part of an Indian-based healthcare provider that then bids for the contracts in the UK, because by working, you could be living right next door to people in the UK, but actually working for an Indian provider, delivering services in the UK, because the practices of the Indian provider are not so constrained. And once you've got a global workforce of doctors working for that company, the more switched on Brits will be trying to join, saying, well, why is our situation not as good as theirs? And that's probably going to get you past any tipping point.
Well, the thing that occurs to me there is how sort of, as you know, Greg, how non-linear these things are going to end up being, I think. Because there's the example you've just used, but then take one that's proximate perhaps to Saski's role. So, if you're an eye surgeon, there's increasingly technologies that would allow you to do that remotely using kind of VR type stuff. So you could be doing your work at home and your patient's in another country. So you've got examples like that. But then I think you've also got other examples like I think we're seeing in the world of home care, where essentially we've made those roles so unattractive, so unsustainable, that the people that end up with them, well, I mean, there are different sort of cohorts, if you like, within the domiciliary care workforces. I've experienced it. You get people who are doing it just because it's almost like a student job, You know, it's kind of, well, it pays all right and I'm only going to do it in the short term. You get people who do it because they're doing it almost vocationally. They're like semi-retired and they're doing it. But you have very few people who are able to do it and do it sustainably in the long term as a career. And I think those sorts of sectors, I think, are where I take Jose's point to be most acute, where actually just the external pressure on those sectors to have to shift is going to become acute. So that was a bit of a ramble. There was another thought I wanted to share, if you don't mind, folks, which hadn't occurred to me until this conversation tonight, but it was, if we think back in paying attention to James's point, a very Western view of history here, but if we think back in history about the relationship between church, state and industry, I also wonder how that plays out in this paradigm shift, because I think what we've got for a great many people, I mean, even if you just take west of Scotland where I grew up, in my generation when I was born, you had essentially everybody was either a Catholic or a Protestant, bar, you know, a tiny percentage, and they were church-going Catholics and Protestants, and that ethos informed how they came at the world, including how they were at work and how they related to each other and all the rest of it. And that has been kind of substantially evaporated off as a way of life, even in the west of Scotland. And what occurs to me about it, and I see it in my parents' generation where they were churchgoers, they've given all that up, but they know that there's a gap left in their life, so they haven't actually given up in a way that leaves that gap completely exposed. They've started to replace it with other things like community groups and book groups and ways of self-organizing. And I wonder if that's also how this paradigm shifts, that actually people's religious life, spiritual life, community life, or whatever is more kind of activated from a genuine sense of human to human relation, rather than, if you take, you know, certainly Western Christianity as I experienced it, that's the forced paradigm writ large, isn't it? It's like do good or go to hell. but I think we just aren't tolerant of that in our spiritual life now. And I wonder if that intolerance of that sort of force then starts to leak across as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's exactly, it is all of these things put together. This isn't like one little thing that's changing, right? It's this, it's everything coming together, from the historical things that you're pointing out and the way that we're seeing climate change and the way we're seeing our economic systems. Greg put in chat about Brexit, and how we're seeing our political system. I think all of these things are coming to a point where we need to make that change, and we don't, it's not like we're going to consciously make that change. We're making that change out of just sheer reaction to an environment that is unacceptable. And so we find those spots, we find the ways to communicate with each other, we find the ways to connect with one another that aren't built on force, but are driven from us. And so whether it's, as you said, book clubs or whatever, it's stuff that we want to do. It's stuff that we're compelled to want, rather than something that we have to go on Sunday and we have to do this. And if we don't show up dressed up nice and tidy, then something's wrong with us. I think that's the big shift. It's interesting that we manifested at work, and I think it's, I'm not sure if it was Greg or James that said, you know, work is kind of the last thing, but I think it fundamentally changes work as the system. So it changes all those behaviors in us, but it's really fundamentally the first system that will change will be work. That's what I think is the paradigm shift. It's not that it's the thing that changes, it's that everything else changes in our lives, and impacts work first from a systemic perspective.
One of the most exciting areas around it is actually how people get to manage a life as a family unit or life within a community. So what we've had is people who have, well, you've got 2 adults and children in a household, and they've had to actually do almost tag teaming. And this has become possible, and we've opened up the door to that through the responses to COVID. And it's actually showing that there is actually scope for not outsourcing absolutely every bit of being a member of a community to others, which is what I think has tended to happen when people were working from the office. So I think the most exciting bit for me about from a British point of view is that after all the pressure for so long has been driving people out of communities during the daytime and leading to the professionalization of everything from care services to early years provision and all that sort of thing, that we might actually finally turn the corner on that, and we might actually start to see people get enough hours back in their day. You know, if they're losing hours of commuting because they're actually able to work remotely, does that free up time to actually do the sort of things that Andy was just talking about, having been part and parcel of a community life a generation ago? But I'm still not going to hold my breath that that'll happen. There's too many other pressures involved in the system. Trying to predict it is a little bit dubious in my eyes.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, oh, James, go on.
No, sorry, I was just being facetious. So what you're saying, Greg, is downside is we get more time with our family. Christ. That's,
I better not say anything to that because my family are just right there. But what I was going to say, and again, there's no guarantee in this, but it's back to that idea of the sort of evolutionary or the long-term view of it. It feels to me like, looked at through that lens, I do think progress is easier to see through a positive lens than a negative one, I think. I mean, I'm mindful again of your point earlier, James, there, but I think, I suppose my feeling in response to your earlier point is, if you asked someone from many generations ago to look at their life relative to the life that they would have today, they would probably view it positively. But that doesn't mean that today's life's perfect. And it certainly doesn't mean that, looked at through the lens of today's generation, that they don't experience it as just as negative as, you know, the person in the past might have experienced it. But I mean, to think about the circumstances that some of my ancestors would have been in compared to what I'm in now, it's like, you know, I'm all right. And I know I'm kind of fairly lucky anyway, but I think you can do that for a lot of people in a lot of circumstances, and there's progress. So I guess my reflection on Greg's point in terms of not predicting the future is, for sure, of course, in some senses, but the trajectory does feel like it's trying to take us towards, you know, almost through the Maslow lens, it's trying to take us towards opportunities for greater self-actualization, not just opportunities to feed and shelter ourselves, I think.
Could that also be used as an argument for maintaining the status quo, though? Because arguably our benefits to, well, our economic benefits largely, you know, certainly in the UK, brought off the backs of, you know, slavery and, you know, the empire, and our you know, health benefits brought about by a top-down health system, and the they're creating the opportunity for self-actualization, but then what happens if you take that away?
So I'm totally with you on this one. I mean, I think we might have touched on this before in a conversation, but my personal long-range view of this is that for millennia, we've lived with the force paradigm, but we don't call it that. And what it looks like is, in one way or another, we have either felt or been caused to feel that our ability to just subsist is under threat. And that keeps us all working hard to some degree. But that for me is the force paradigm, and we can say the things I've said about it in terms of, but it's got us to where we are. So then if you take your point that, well, given it's got us to where we are, maybe that hegemonizes it and leaves us locked into it. But I think the next coming set of pressures are that, in part, there's the bit about we can all see that potential for a more purposeful life, and there's pressure from there. But I also think that the force paradigm doesn't just exist between us as humans, it exists between humans and the universe, nature. And I think in a sense, the universe is pushing back right now, isn't it? It's saying, you've exploited me. And you're about to run out of road on that one, buddy. So I also wonder whether that's another thing that will precipitate a shift of, do we have to start to think through the lens of mutuality, not just in terms of with each other, but with the planet, the universe, and everything else? And it's going to demand it of us.
I would agree with all that, Andy, except I wonder if the word isn't think. I wonder if the word is feel. I think we've been thinking a lot as part of this force paradigm. And force paradigm, I agree with you, has been around for a very long time, but it was physical until a couple of 100 years ago. And then we started to realize that we could use socioeconomic force. And so we no longer needed slaves. We could just compel people to work because we had a system of money, a system of force that was a little nicer, but still compelled people to work. And we've continued to make it nicer and nicer. And we no longer make people work 12-hour days and 6 days a week or 7 days a week. Okay, except for the medical field. Sorry, Saskia. But I think that has changed, right? And it's gotten better and better and better and better. But it comes to a point where that alone isn't sufficient, that we still feel like there's something else. And now we've got young people that feel that not only there's that something else with our relationship with our society, but that there are these huge hurdles and problems that we've created for ourselves that need to be resolved. I mean, our girls talk more about climate change and the dirtying of our water and the spoiling of our seas and so on and so forth than they do about what their career is going to look like. That's what comes up in dinner conversations more than. That is top of mind for them in a way that even though we feel it, they live it, whereas we just talk about it intellectually. And I think that feeling, that's what's going to drive this change. It's those feelings in us more than conceptualizing and thinking about how we're going to change the system and adapt the system and get the system to flow. I think that kind of thinking is just, we're not going to be able to have that thinking. What we have is this innate drive, these feelings that are going to push people, compel people to want something different, make something different, and have the tools to create that something different for themselves. This isn't about creating something, it's about getting out of the way of something that's going to get created. That is my belief. It's going to happen. It's how do we allow for it to happen? How do we hope that it happens in a good way rather than a bad way? And how do we ourselves contribute to it rather than fight against it.
And I think we need to take on board the lessons of things like Black Lives Matters and actually start thinking now of, you know, who's going to be the victims of this, which areas are going to effectively get left behind by this. I mean, you look about paradigm shifts and all the rest of it. I mean, Britain, from my childhood to now, has lost all the pits, the car industry vanished, manufacturing industry, whole things have changed out of all recognition, but the legacy is still alive and well. I mean, I'm living in West Yorkshire and I find it all around me. So yeah, lots of areas are going to be well poised to capitalize nicely on this, but we've got to expect that an entire underclass is going to be a victim of this paradigm shift, and it's likely to be a lot of the same people that were the victims of the last paradigm shift and the one before that, because these things get systematized. So yeah, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be political conflict over it, but there's always victims.
I disagree. Yes, there's always victims, because any change is going to create a counterbalance or a counterforce. That I agree. But I think that partly to the question, because I've been wanting to get back to your question from half an hour ago or an hour ago, Greg, about Brexit and Trump. I think this is going to be a shift that's actually going to come from those classes rather than against those classes. And I think that the rebellion that we see inside countries like the UK and the United States from people who have been left out of this trajectory of globalization and education and digitization and all that kind of stuff. If there's a system that emerges where those people can actually be more human and to express themselves and to live lives that are more in keeping with who they are, I think those are the winners. And it's the people who are so systematized, so entrenched in the world of force, they're the ones that are going to suffer. I think the people that are going to suffer in this are not so much what we traditionally called workers, but the people who are the maintainers of those systems. That's my gut. That's where I think that's the parallel back to the train scenario, right? We own the country. We've built, as train companies, we built this country, and everybody thought they had it made. And within 50 years, it was all dismantled, completely dismantled from peak to bottom. And I think that's what we're going to experience.
I like the optimism.
So I think my ultimate take personally is I really don't know what's going to happen. I mean, kind of obviously none of us really know, but I definitely flip between feeling optimistic and less so. I think the opportunity of this paradigm shift, at least as articulated by Jose, is that if it were an example of being capable of genuinely being achieved, then I think there wouldn't be victims of it per se, because the nature of what the shift is that it's about interdependence and mutuality and these sorts of things. So the extent to which there is a victim in that, if it's a victim that looks like someone who's refusing to be interdependent and mutual, then I don't think it's actually contrary to the paradigm shift we want to achieve to say that that sort of individual should be a victim of this. And where I'm coming from on that is if you look at all the modeling around game theory stuff, I mean, this is very crude, but you know, the idea of game theory basically, first of all, it assumes scarcity and therefore everybody is in that context. But second of all, I think its kind of core lesson is that, you know, if you collaborate, you win unless you're dealing with a dick. But the key strategy for how to win in the context of dicks is treat dicks like dicks. You know, in other words, don't try and collaborate with them. So they have the opportunity to collaborate. If they're not going to do that, then let them lose. In fact, ensure they lose. So I sort of think, and again, I might be speaking out of turn here. I don't know that Jose necessarily agrees with this at all, but I think, you know, if the fundamental principles underneath this are how do we create a win-win reality, the answer is it's win-win with those that are prepared to play that game. And if what you really want is just to win and you don't give a shit about whether everybody else loses, well, you're not playing the right game, so you get to lose.
Yeah, I was on a Tools of the Regenerative Renaissance series of engagements over the last couple of months. In some ways, some of the themes were very reminiscent of the 70s and 80s, where you were looking at people on the fringes, taking radically different approaches, envisaging a radically different future. But what was quite stunning was how many of the focus areas involved technology and technological literacy, and a lot of the opportunities that might be coming this way with this paradigm shift might be in the world of Bitcoin and cyber currencies and a completely deregulated world. And the barriers to entry are substantial. And I think the freedoms that are there are huge. You are looking at the possibility of lots of things becoming off-grid and completely unregulatable. And that could be part of this same paradigm shift. So I think there are areas of worry that are on a scale that we are only just starting to be able to apprehend. And yeah, I think.
Greg, I love your pessimism. Yeah. So here's some of my answers to that. 30 years ago, the number of people that had a home computer was, or knew how to use one, was very small. Today, everyone has one in their pocket. And the number of people that knew how to use a computer required that they knew how to program or had sophisticated use. And today, the average 2-year-old knows how to run a computer and does so all day long, unfortunately. I think that hurdle that you talk about, it only exists for a very short period of time until we take blockchain and put it on the phone, and the average 2-year-old can operate a blockchain contract by swiping right or swiping left or whatever the heck it could be. So I agree that all of that contributes to it. I just don't think that it becomes a hurdle. It's a hurdle today because it's nascent technology, but it's actually not a hurdle, but an empowerment tool. It allows us to build those protocols that I was talking about earlier, where anybody in the world can interact with someone else, engage with someone else on a quote unquote business dealing, and never have to deal with a lawyer, never have to deal with a contract, never have to deal with local laws or governmental laws or things of that nature, that they're actually doing so on the basis of this trust-based system that operates on that. So I think we have to look at the evolution of these tools as much as recognize that it's going to take some time for them to get there. But when they do, this is a fundamental change that we, in the order of something that we've never seen before. Hate to always contradict you, Greg, but I love the fact that you're pushing those issues.
My sense as well is that I don't think I don't think the pushing back and forth here is that we wouldn't all aspire to something like what we're describing. I think what I really value about your pushback, Greg, is the challenge it creates in terms of thinking about the practicalities, etc., and the true nature of the issues, and also the reminder that I think it offers around, you know, so you put it as who's the victims, but you know, like nothing comes without a shadow side, right? So let's be aware of the shadow side. Folks, I'm sorry to do this, but I'm going to have to depart myself, but that doesn't mean I can't leave you here to continue to have fun. So I'm happy to do that if you want. I'm equally happy to give you the opportunity to say the weekend starts here. So whatever you want to do.
I need to go myself in a couple of minutes here, Andy. So I think that works.
Cool. Well, shall we wrap it there? So I'm going to send round the video of this and the text chat and all that sort of stuff. Yes, so you can share that with anyone that you think would benefit. And hopefully I'll see you back here in a month's time for the next one, if not before.
Brilliant.
Okay.